Hey guys, so you see the title. Today we're going to be talking about 15 horror movies that are so bad they're good, and I personally love this kind of subgenre of horror. I think there's something charming and endearing about a movie that is kind of technically bad, but we still enjoy it for some reason. There's usually aspects to these movies that make us love them. And even though it's my favorite era of horror, when I think of bad horror movies that are actually good, I tend to think of a lot of early 2000s movies, and especially a lot of teen early 2000s movies, so I feel like most of my list is teen early 2000s movies. But before we get into the list, I just want to thank Shudder for sponsoring this video. Shudder is a premium streaming service for all things horror, thriller, and suspense. You can stream their horror classics, blockbuster hits, originals, and exclusives such as Tigers Are Not Afraid and the Creepshow series, which I actually have the original Creepshow on my patch on my jacket. Completely ad-free on all of your devices, including iOS and Android, Xbox One, Amazon Fire TV, Google Chromecast, and Roku. One movie I've recently watched on Shudder that I would highly recommend, that's an early 2000s kind of hidden gem. It's kind of, I don't know, it's a little strange, but it is called Stuck. It is based on a true story and gets weirdly disturbing, so check it out if you want something to watch. You can stream Shudder for $5.99 a month or $56.99 per year, or you can go to shudder.com and use my code POSSESSED30 for a free 30-day trial. So first up on my list of movies that are so bad they're actually good, The Haunting of Molly Hartley. A lot of you were actually shocked that I didn't include this movie in my top 10 movies of all time. It's not technically good, guys, right? We acknowledge this. I've talked about it a million times on this channel, but I love this movie and I continuously go back to rewatch it. So the movie follows a girl whose parents sold her soul to the devil to save her life when she was an infant, and when she turns 18, strange things begin to happen to her, and she's left questioning if it's real or if she inherited her mother's mental illness. Everything about this movie is completely cheesy, but it does have some decent actors in it. Obviously, what makes this movie technically bad is the unbelievable storyline, including the really bad and cheesy ending. Like, it's really cheesy, and so it just makes you roll your eyes. Although, technically, I kind of like the ending, and I'm not gonna explain why because I don't want to spoil the movie in this video. I think the best thing by far about the movie is the soundtrack. I listened to the soundtrack, or a couple songs from it, so much after I watched this movie, so definitely look up the soundtrack too. But just watch it if you haven't seen it yet. No, it's a bad movie, generally. A lot of people have told me that they watched it on my recommendation and they hated it, but I warn you guys every time, it is technically a bad movie, but I really love it. All right, next on this list is Sorority Row. This came out in 2009. This is a slasher movie that follows a sorority after a prank goes wrong and they accidentally kill one of their own, played by none other than Adrena Patridge. Then a killer slowly begins picking them off one by one for revenge. What makes this movie particularly bad is pretty much the acting. I mean, it's okay. It's a cheesy teen, well, it's like college slasher, so that pretty much describes right there why it's technically a bad movie. Obviously, the plot and the story development are kind of ridiculous. A lot of things just aren't realistic about this, even though it's a slasher and not like a supernatural, but you are questioning whether it's a supernatural or not. My favorite thing about this movie is hands down the death scenes. It has like a variety of different types of deaths, and they're very creative, very over the top, like so over the top. But the movie is gory and it's brutal and the effects are actually pretty good. I also feel like this movie is almost self-aware also with how cheesy it is and kind of uses that to its advantage. I mean, it takes place at a sorority, college slasher. It's over the top and cheesy, but I feel like it knows that and it adds to the movie experience. Next up, we have Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. This came out in 1986 and it's directed also by Tobe Hooper. It follows a radio host captured and terrorized by Leatherface and his family. So this movie is actually a black comedy and not a straight up horror like its predecessor, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I actually personally love that they chose to do that. I don't think they could have like done another movie like Texas Chainsaw, the first one, so the fact that they decided to go a different route and Tobe Hooper wanted to make a black comedy instead of a horror movie, I think the fact that they made that choice is what makes the movie so amazing. But of course, it's not perfect, right? Because it's on this list. At first glance, it is very cheesy and technically bad. The writing is so over the top. The characters are so over the top, including Chop Top, which he hands down, he's played by Bill Moseley, and he is hands down the best part of this movie. It's all a little outrageous, it's goofy, it's a black comedy, but it, you know, takes place in the Texas Chainsaw universe, so personally, I love that combo. Next up is Clown from 2014, and I don't think y'all ready to talk about how good Clown really is. So Clown follows a father who discovers a clown costume and wears it for his son's birthday party, only to find it doesn't ever come off, and it causes him to transform into a killer clown. I know what you're thinking. You've either seen the movie and think it's terrible, or you're listening to me explain it and this is the first time you're hearing about it and you think it sounds terrible. It is produced by Eli Roth, and thus it gets very brutal. They aren't afraid of anything in this movie. It's pretty disturbing. There are children deaths in this, which I personally like that they chose to go there, because if they didn't, it really would have been a terrible, terrible movie. And a lot of people actually think this is a really bad movie. I put this on for my friends and they just made fun of it the whole time. So, and I understand how the plot sounds and how it comes across and how ridiculous it is, but if you just accept that first and foremost as, yes, it's a cheesy, outrageous kind of idea, I think it's really executed well, and it's a good journey to go on in this movie, and I just say give it a chance. I really love this movie. I didn't even think it was bad when I saw it, but not many people like it, so I had to put it on this list. I couldn't make this list without including House of Wax, could I? The 2005 remake, that is. So House of Wax, of course, follows a group of friends on their way to a football game, but they get a flat tire that leaves them stranded in a ghost town where they discover a wax museum. This one is pretty well known and loved for being a bad and cheesy movie. I think when it first came out, it didn't really get its cult following yet, and I think as time went on, people realized that it's just an enjoyable movie, and yes, it's very cheesy. I mean, Paris Hilton screaming. That's so much entertainment right there. I also really like the gore in it. I think the effects are really good. And of course, this is a quintessential early 2000s movie, so it has a lot of aspects to it that I really love, including a little bit of camping vibes. Another one I had to include on this list, Evil Dead from 1981. Evil Dead follows a group of friends that stay at a cabin in the woods where they find the Book of the Dead that, when read aloud, reawakens the dead. This is probably a really obvious choice, and I didn't even need to include it because this one is so well known for being, I don't want to say it's technically bad, because I really don't think it is, especially for its era. I think it's cheesy looking back. No, it was pretty cheesy for its era, actually. But I think it was self-aware. I mean, it's a campy 80s movie, and that was a common theme throughout the 80s, to make things cheesy and campy. Before that era, it was a really good movie, and I think really affected a lot of people. And I really don't think this movie is bad on like a technical level. I think it's just cheesy watching it today. But I do really like how they portray the possessions and everything. I think it's genuinely a little terrifying, but I think the over-the-top nature of this movie really works for it and makes it a good horror movie. Next is Cabin Fever 2 Spring Fever, which came out in 2009. It's directed by Ty West, who I think is a little bit underrated in the horror community. Maybe not really, but to me, I think he's a little underrated. He's done movies such as The Sacrament and The Innkeepers. So Cabin Fever 2 Spring Fever is about a high school prom that is ruined, to say the least, by the flesh-eating virus that is spread through bottled water. So this one, I think, is the perfect sequel to Cabin Fever because it's different enough, it separates itself enough from the first one that we get an entirely new movie. They didn't just recreate the same kind of concept, and it takes place right after the first movie, and it kind of takes you through the process of how the disease gets into the bottled water and then gets to the high school. And it has the same tone to the first movie, and the plot makes sense. Yet it is also very over the top. If anything, it pushes it way farther than the first Cabin Fever with its gratuitous gore and sometimes nudity. So it's definitely a bit too much at times. Don't eat when you watch it, you know? This movie is technically bad for many reasons that I've already stated for other movies. You know, it's cheesy, it's over the top, it's It's a teen horror. But if you can look past these aspects and just accept that you're in for a cheesy ride, I think it's actually a really entertaining and gross movie, which is actually a good thing because it's similar to the first one. So if you're a fan of the first Cabin Fever, you'd probably like Spring Fever. Next up is the 2008 movie Asylum. And I don't hear anyone talk about this movie ever, so I'm glad we get to talk about it today. So this takes place in a dorm that is being haunted by a dead psychiatrist, since part of their building used to be an old asylum where the doctor tortured his patients. I think this one could almost be seen as objectively bad and not really have anything going for it, at least with the previous movies I've talked about. They've had like something strong about them, whether it be the gore, soundtrack, acting, story. This one doesn't really have any of those things going for it. The special effects are bad, the acting generally bad. It stars the girl from Disturbia, so it doesn't have too much going for it in the positives, but there is something about it that makes me want to rewatch it. I own it on DVD. I just think it is a good, enjoyable movie if you just accept that that it's gonna be a little bad. A guilty pleasure movie, I guess you could say. You know, I don't like using that term because we just like what we like and there should be no guilt associated with that. But if you wanna put it in a category, it's kind of one of those. This did get terrible ratings and reviews when it was released. I just think I like it because bad teen horror is like right up my alley. So that's why I'm like drawn to this kind of movie, especially because it's early 2000s too. Next up is Rest Stop, which came out in 2006. We got a lot of early 2000s movies. I warned you, it's a lot of early 2000s movies. Rest Stop follows a couple that stop at, you guessed it, a rest stop so she can pee, and when she comes out, her boyfriend is gone, and then a yellow truck begins antagonizing her while she attempts to be rescued. I think Rest Stop is definitely a B movie, but I think it is an underrated gem because if you can look past the bad aspects of this movie and the cheesiness of it all, I think it's actually really creative and really interesting, and I really love the story development of it. And it is ambitious with its plot and effects, given that it's a B movie, but I do think the writing is actually pretty good, and if you're going into it knowing you're watching a B horror movie, I think it's very enjoyable. I should point out though, before you watch it, it has 0% on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, I don't care about critic reviews like that because that doesn't matter, it's arbitrary, you know, it's just other people's opinions. And I really don't take that into consideration, but it just proves that this movie is so bad that it can be good. At least for some horror fans, I think, will enjoy it. Next up is Terrifier, which came out last year, and this has to be the best example and the most recent example of a bad horror movie that's so bad it's good. So Terrifier follows two girls on Halloween night as a serial killer clown terrorizes them. This movie is actually based on a short film from All Hallows Eve where Art the Clown first appeared. And I personally think Art the Clown is one of the best, most creative villains or killers that we've gotten in the last decade, especially because I feel like a lot of the 2010s movies are focused a lot on supernatural instead of killers. This of course is a cheesy slasher Halloween night kind of movie with pretty bad acting besides Art. He's great, but the gore isn't that bad. I actually really enjoyed the gore in this movie, and I personally find this movie very entertaining and cheesy in like all the best ways. Next up is Unfriended from 2014. This follows a group of high school friends on a Skype call that becomes haunted by a student who died and who was previously bullied, so it's kind of a revenge story. Now this movie is so ridiculous given the plot of it, and I know it's supernatural, so it's not meant to be super realistic, but obviously this movie doesn't really make any sense and none of it's really that believable, so it's kind of hard to immerse yourself in it, although they do try to immerse you in it because it's all filmed or at least shown on a MacBook computer screen. And I really like this detail. I think it makes it pretty creative because you're never bored. You're constantly looking around, your eyes, you know, you're dancing around different pages that she's got open and different windows and things. So I think it's a very interesting movie visually. Obviously this is generally a bad movie, right? But I think it has its charms and I love the creative way that they portrayed the movie, and I do think it gets pretty dark and gruesome and gory, but I think they do it in such a smart way because it's filmed on the screens, so it doesn't have to be too effective or too good, but I think it comes across as really good, if that makes any sense at all. Next up might be a surprise if you've been a viewer of my channel for a long time, The Gallows, that came out in 2015. I actually reviewed this when it came out and hated it, so I gave it a very negative review, I believe. But here we are in 2020, and I own it on DVD. So The Gallows is a found footage style movie that follows a group of high school friends who break into their school to tear down the theater set. Little do they know it's actually haunted by a past student who died in a theater accident on stage while performing. Obviously, I didn't like this movie when it first came out, and I think that's only because it's technically not a great movie. I mean, say it with me now. Cheesy. But obviously I love that it's a found footage movie. That's one of my favorite subgenres of horror, and it's a teen horror. So I think I was really just in denial about liking this movie because there are so many aspects about it that scream my taste in horror, so I don't know, I think I was just in denial. So. Also, I am planning a video dedicated to movies that I've actually changed my mind on, whether it be positively or negatively. Next up is From Beyond, which came out in 1986, and this is actually my most recent horror movie watch, and I will probably go more in depth in a separate mini review in a horror movies I've watched lately video. But after watching it, I knew it had to go on this list. So this is a sci-fi body horror loosely based on a short story by H.P. Lovecraft, and it follows a pair of scientists that try to stimulate the pineal gland as a sixth sense, and their experiments go wrong, and one of them is taken into another world, and he returns as a shape-shifting monster. Now, the body horror in this is fantastic. I mean, it's not like the greatest, it's not the thing by any means, but they did spend a huge chunk of their budget on practical effects, which I appreciate. Even if it doesn't look the greatest, the fact that like production companies and movies used practical effects, especially in the 80s, is just why that's one of the best decades of horror. But generally with this movie, From Beyond, the acting is just comical and just outrageous some of the times, and you know, you laugh when you watch it. And I don't know if it's self-aware and that was intentional, or if it's just the campy 80s kind of horror that's coming through. Now, this movie is done by Stuart Gordon, who also did Reanimator, if that tells you anything. Now, their special effects of like the floating slugs and everything, not the greatest and very bad, but it was the 80s, so we have to kind of forgive that. But they did use practical effects for most of the effects, which I can appreciate. All right, the last movie on this list pains me to put on this list, and I cringe at myself by putting it on this list. I might even get eaten alive in the comments, but that's kind of the point of this video. I know I'm gonna get a lot of disagreeing people commenting on this video. The Bye Bye Man. I know. So The Bye Bye Man follows a group of college friends who discover the origins of the Bye Bye Man, which causes people to commit horrible acts of violence. And how do you avoid it? Don't say it! Don't think it! Much like The Gallows, this is a movie that I hated when I first saw it, and I think I gave it a negative review. I know I gave it a negative review as well. I also had a very terrible theater experience while watching this. I mean, it's super cheesy, and a lot of it is just silly. I mean, the name of the movie alone, The Bye Bye Man, is just not horrifying in any way. It's just like silly. However, I realized that this was yet another movie that I had changed my mind on when I suddenly had the urge to rewatch it, and I, you know, pushed that down for a long time. I was like, we're not watching that. We're not gonna why do you want to rewatch that? But I did, and I enjoyed it. So here we are. I think the best part of this movie, hands down, is the opening sequence, and I wish it kind of kept that tone throughout. It's shot in like one continuous take, or appears to be shot in one continuous take, and it does change tone after that, because then it kind of becomes a cheesy college movie. But there is obviously something that draws me to it that made me want to rewatch it. Still, you know, continuously want to rewatch it. So obviously it's not that bad. I enjoy it, so it's so bad it's good, maybe? So there you have 15 horror movies that are so bad they're good. And you know, it's just my opinion. I like these movies. You're gonna hate a lot of them, I bet, and that's fine. Please tell me in the comments what you think about all these movies, and tell me some more of your personal favorites that you think are so bad that they're actually enjoyable. Anyway, make sure you check out Shudder. Go to shudder.com, use my code POSSESSED30 for a free 30 days. Now is the perfect time to take advantage of that. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.